The mirror doesn't lie, but it doesn't tell the whole truth either. Eleanor stood before her bedroom mirror on a sweltering July morning, holding up the same floral sundress she'd worn every summer for the past 15 years. At 73, she developed what her daughter called comfort habits, those reliable choices that felt safe but no longer felt quite right. It started with a simple comment at her neighborhood book club. "You know, Eleanor," said her friend Patricia, adjusting her crisp linen blazer, "I used to think getting older meant settling for less. But I've discovered it's actually about choosing better." Patricia had transformed her entire wardrobe after turning 70, embracing what she called senior empowerment through style. She radiated confidence in a way that made Eleanor pause and wonder when she'd stopped caring about how she presented herself to the world. The conversation lingered in Eleanor's mind for days. She began noticing things. How certain clothes made her feel invisible rather than comfortable. How some fashion choices seemed to age her beyond her years, and how others her age carried themselves with such grace and authority. There was something powerful about women who embraced life after 60 with intention and style, refusing to fade into the background simply because society expected it. Eleanor's awakening came during a particularly hot afternoon when she caught her reflection in a store window. The oversized, shapeless clothing she'd gravitated toward for comfort had somehow become a costume of surrender. She realized she'd been dressing like someone who'd given up, not someone who was still living fully. The emotional wisdom that comes with decades of experience had taught her to value substance over superficiality. But somewhere along the way, she'd confused caring less about others' opinions with not caring about herself at all. That evening, she made a decision that surprised even her. She would spend the summer learning what it meant to dress with confidence at her age. Not to look younger. She'd earned every one of her 73 years, but to look like the vibrant, thoughtful woman she still was inside. She wanted to understand the difference between age-appropriate and age-defeating, between comfortable and careless. The journey began with research. Eleanor discovered that stylish seniors shared certain principles. They avoided clothes that overwhelmed their frames, embraced quality over quantity, and understood that certain summer staples that worked in their 40s became unflattering liabilities in their 70s. She learned about the 5 key items that fashion-forward women over 70 consciously avoided during hot weather. Not because they were too old to wear them, but because they were too wise to choose unflattering options when better alternatives existed. But this wasn't just about clothing. As Eleanor began her style transformation, she uncovered something deeper about independent living and self-respect. Each choice became an act of honoring herself, a declaration that her story wasn't over. It was simply entering a new, more intentional chapter. The real surprise came 3 months into her journey, when Eleanor looked in that same bedroom mirror and barely recognized the confident woman staring back. The changes weren't dramatic, but they were profound. However, her newfound confidence was about to be tested in ways she never expected. Because sometimes, the most important style choice isn't what you wear, it's who you decide to be when the world tries to make you invisible. What happened next would challenge everything Eleanor thought she knew about aging gracefully. Hashtag Chapter 2. The weight of yesterday's choices. Eleanor's transformation hadn't happened in a vacuum. The truth was, she'd been hiding behind shapeless clothes for reasons that went deeper than simple comfort. 5 years earlier, when her husband Richard passed away suddenly, she'd packed away more than his belongings. She'd tucked away pieces of herself she thought no longer mattered. Life after retirement had been nothing like the golden years brochures promised. Richard had been the social one, the planner, the dreamer who talked about travel and adventure. When he was gone, Eleanor found herself adrift in a house that felt too big and days that stretched too long. The woman who had once coordinated charity events and hosted dinner parties gradually retreated into a smaller, quieter version of herself. Her children meant well, but their concern often felt like pity. "Mom, you should join a senior center," her son would suggest during their weekly calls. "There are activities, people your age, people her age, as if she'd been relegated to some separate category of human existence, where friendship was based solely on shared birth decades rather than genuine connection. The morning she decided to change her wardrobe, Eleanor had been sorting through old photo albums. There she was at 65, vibrant, engaged, wearing a beautiful coral blazer at their anniversary dinner. She remembered feeling elegant that night, worthy of Richard's admiring glances. When had she stopped believing she deserved to feel that way about herself? Senior reflection often brings uncomfortable truths, and Eleanor's was this. She'd been grieving not just Richard, but the woman she used to be when someone loved her unconditionally. Without his daily affirmations and gentle encouragement, she'd forgotten how to see her own worth. The baggy clothes, the neutral colors, the practical above all else mindset. They were all symptoms of a woman who'd stopped believing she mattered beyond her roles as mother and grandmother. But finding purpose after such profound loss required more than new clothes. Eleanor began to understand that her style journey was really about reclaiming her identity. She started small, replacing the worn-out basics in her closet with pieces that actually fit properly. She learned that the 5 summer items stylish seniors avoided weren't just about looking good. They were about understanding your body, honoring your shape, and refusing to disappear into fabric. The emotional resilience she was building surprised her. Each shopping trip became an exercise in self-advocacy. Instead of grabbing the first thing in her size, she asked questions. Does this make me feel confident? Does this reflect who I am now, not who I think I should be? The answers weren't always easy, but they were honest. Her neighbor Patricia became an unexpected mentor, sharing stories about her own journey through widowhood and reinvention. I spent 2 years wearing Richard's old sweaters, Patricia confessed over coffee. I thought if I looked small enough, the grief wouldn't find me. But honey, grief finds you anyway. Might as well face it looking like yourself. Eleanor discovered that many women her age were navigating similar crossroads, the space between who they'd been and who they were becoming. Some had lost spouses, others were dealing with health changes, empty nests, or simply the accumulated weight of decades spent prioritizing everyone else's needs above their own. The real breakthrough came when Eleanor realized she wasn't trying to recapture her younger self. She was uncovering her present self, a woman with different needs, preferences, and strengths than she'd had at 40 or 50. This wasn't about turning back time. It was about moving forward with intention. But just as Eleanor was beginning to feel confident in her new direction, an unexpected encounter would test everything she'd learned about self-worth and second chances. Hashtag Chapter 3. Unexpected Reflections. The encounter came on a Tuesday afternoon at the local farmer's market. Eleanor had chosen a soft lavender blouse, one of her new purchases that actually complemented her silver hair instead of washing her out. She was examining heirloom tomatoes when she heard a familiar voice behind her. Eleanor? Eleanor Patterson. She turned to find David Chun, her former colleague from the nonprofit where she'd worked before Richard's illness forced her early retirement. David looked distinguished at 71, his salt and pepper hair neatly trimmed, wearing clothes that spoke of someone comfortable in his own skin. For a moment, Eleanor felt the old insecurity creep back. Would he see the woman she'd become, or remembered the capable administrator she used to be? David, she managed, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. What a lovely surprise. Their conversation flowed naturally, touching on mutual friends and shared memories. But Eleanor found herself studying David's face, remembering things she'd forgotten about herself. She'd been good at her job, really good. She'd coordinated fundraising events that brought in hundreds of thousands of dollars, managed volunteers with grace under pressure, and somehow made everyone feel valued and heard. You know, David said as they walked between the market stalls, I still use your volunteer training manual. 20 years later, and it's still the gold standard. You had such insight into what motivated people. The compliment hit deeper than expected. Eleanor realized she'd been so focused on defining herself as Richard's widow, as her children's mother, as someone's grandmother, that she'd forgotten she'd once been Eleanor the strategist, Eleanor the problem solver, Eleanor, the woman who could walk into a room and command respect through quiet competence. This was what senior reflection really meant. Not just looking back with nostalgia, but excavating buried strengths and forgotten capabilities. The woman who had successfully managed million-dollar budgets hadn't disappeared when she put on baggy clothes and retreated from the world. She'd simply been hibernating. "I've been thinking about volunteering again," Eleanor heard herself say, surprising them both. "Maybe it's time to dust off some old skills." David's eyes lit up. "We're launching a new program for aging advocacy. Someone with your background could really make a difference." He paused, studying her face. "You look well, Eleanor. Different somehow. More present. Present." The word resonated as they parted ways with exchanged phone numbers and tentative plans. Eleanor had spent 5 years feeling like a ghost haunting her own life, but something fundamental was shifting. The style changes weren't just about clothing. They were about showing up fully in her own life again. That evening, Eleanor called her daughter Sarah for their usual check-in, but the conversation took an unexpected turn. "Mom, you sound different," Sarah observed. "Stronger somehow." Eleanor looked at herself in the hallway mirror, seeing the woman in the lavender blouse who'd held her own in conversation with a respected colleague. "I think I'm remembering who I used to be," she said slowly. "Or maybe discovering who I'm supposed to be now." "What do you mean?" Eleanor thought about David's comment, about feeling present. "I think I've been so afraid of being alone that I forgot I could still be whole." "Does that make sense?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Mom, I've been worried about you for years. Not just since Dad died, since before that, when you're taking care of him. You disappeared piece by piece, and I didn't know how to help you find your way back." The conversation continued late into the evening, touching on regrets and possibilities, on the challenge of finding purpose when life's second act looks nothing like what you'd planned. Eleanor realized her children had been watching her struggle, wanting to help, but not knowing how to reach someone who'd wrapped herself so tightly in grief and self-doubt. But beneath her growing confidence lurked a deeper question that would soon force her to confront the most difficult truth of all. The truth arrived in the form of a manila envelope 3 weeks later, delivered by a courier who waited while Eleanor signed with trembling fingers. Inside were legal documents that made her stomach drop. Richard's business partner was contesting the will, claiming Richard had promised him a larger share of the company before his death. The partnership they'd built over 30 years was now in jeopardy, and with it, Eleanor's financial security. She stared at the papers spread across her kitchen table, remembering conversations she'd half listened to while focused on Richard's medical appointments and treatments. Had she missed something important? Had her devotion to caregiving blinded her to crucial business decisions that now threatened everything? The irony wasn't lost on her. Just as she was rediscovering her strength and capability, life was reminding her how vulnerable she really was. The woman who'd been rebuilding her confidence through thoughtful wardrobe choices suddenly faced the possibility of losing her home, her independence, everything she'd worked to reclaim. Eleanor called her son Michael, her voice steadier than she felt. "I need your help understanding something," she said, explaining the situation without the panic she felt inside. This was new territory for her. Asking for help while maintaining her dignity, being vulnerable without being helpless. "Mom, why didn't you tell us this was a possibility?" Michael's concern was palpable across the phone line. "Because I didn't know," Eleanor admitted. "Your father handled the business side of things. I focused on—" She paused, realizing how that sounded. "I focused on everything else." The weeks that followed became a crash course in rediscovery after 60 that Eleanor had never wanted to take. She found herself sitting in lawyers' offices, poring over financial documents, and learning about business practices she'd never needed to understand before. The woman who'd once managed complex fundraising campaigns now had to advocate for herself in an entirely different arena. But something unexpected happened during those difficult weeks. Eleanor discovered she was more resilient than she'd given herself credit for. The organizational skills she'd honed through years of nonprofit work translated perfectly to managing her legal defense. The attention to detail she developed coordinating charity events served her well in reviewing contracts and financial records. Sarah drove up from the city to help, and for the first time in years, Eleanor felt like she was partnering with her daughter rather than being managed by her. They worked side by side, Sarah handling the technology aspects while Eleanor applied her institutional memory and analytical skills to piece together Richard's final business decisions. "You know what strikes me?" Sarah said one evening as they organized documents. "You're handling this crisis better than you handled Dad's death." Eleanor looked up from the paper she was reviewing. "What do you mean? When Dad died, you seemed to shrink. You became smaller, quieter, like you were afraid to take up space. But this situation that would terrify most people, you're meeting it head on. You're not hiding behind oversized sweaters or apologizing for existing." The observation hit Eleanor like a revelation. She was handling this crisis as herself, not as Richard's widow or as someone who needed to be taken care of, but as a competent woman facing a challenge. The style transformation had been the visible part of a deeper change that was now being tested under real pressure. The breakthrough came when Eleanor remembered something Richard had mentioned during his final weeks. A conversation about protecting her future that she'd been too overwhelmed to fully process at the time. Hidden in his desk drawer, she found a folder labeled "For Eleanor," containing documents that would change everything about her legal situation. But as she opened that folder, Eleanor realized the real discovery wasn't what Richard had left her. It was what she'd found in herself through the process of fighting for it. The documents inside the folder told a story Eleanor had never known. Richard had indeed promised his business partner a larger share, but only if Eleanor chose not to remain involved in the company's future. There were detailed notes in Richard's handwriting explaining his reasoning. He believed Eleanor had the skills and experience to take an active role in the business, but he also knew she might prefer a clean break after his death. The choice, he'd written, should be entirely hers to make when she was ready. Eleanor sat in stunned silence, reading her husband's words about her capabilities and potential. He'd seen strengths in her that she'd forgotten she possessed, and he'd structured his final business arrangements to honor whatever path she chose. The legal challenge wasn't about money or broken promises. It was about a future Richard had envisioned for her that she'd never imagined for herself. The revelation hit her with unexpected force. This wasn't just about financial security or legal battles. This was Richard's final gift to her. Not protection from the world, but an invitation to fully engage with it. He'd known that emotional closure after profound loss couldn't be given or guaranteed. It had to be chosen and earned through the courage to keep living fully. When Eleanor called the business partner to discuss the situation, she surprised herself by speaking with the authority of someone who belonged in the conversation. She explained Richard's intentions clearly and offered a compromise that honored both his wishes and the partner's concerns. More importantly, she found herself genuinely interested in the company's future and her potential role in shaping it. Sarah was speechless when Eleanor explained her decision to remain involved in the business rather than simply settle the dispute. "Mom, are you sure? That's a huge commitment at this stage of your life." Eleanor looked at her daughter, remembering the woman she'd been before grief had convinced her to make herself smaller. "Honey, I'm 73 years old. I don't have time to waste on small decisions anymore. This feels like wisdom with age talking, not fear." The conversation that followed became a life's turning point after 60 that neither of them had seen coming. Sarah began sharing her own struggles with confidence and self-doubt, admitting she'd been using her mother's retreat from life as an excuse for her own hesitations about taking professional risks. Eleanor realized that her journey back to herself had been witnessed by her children, who'd been learning from her example, both when she'd hidden from life and now as she reclaimed it. The most profound moment came when Eleanor understood that her months of focusing on style and appearance had never really been about clothes at all. Each time she'd chosen a well-fitted blazer over a shapeless cardigan, each time she'd selected colors that complemented rather than concealed her natural beauty, she'd been practicing small acts of self-respect that prepared her for this larger act of self-advocacy. Standing in her bedroom mirror that evening, Eleanor saw not just a woman in clothes that fit properly, but someone who had grown into her own life again. The 5 summer fashion mistakes she'd learned to avoid were nothing compared to the mistake she'd almost made of avoiding herself. Richard's love had sustained her through decades of marriage, but this discovery, that she could sustain herself through whatever came